Hello, my Galaxians. This is Dr. Wookiee, bringing you a fresh new legal update on the Gala case founder versus founder, which actually reminds me, about a week and a half ago, I was actually threatened by one of the YouTubers. Yeah, I guess they don't think I'm very impartial. It's an unstable one. You probably may have heard of this one, but I'm not going to mention their name because I think they just thrive on negative attention. But thought that was pretty wild. I guess I've made it, my friends. So let's go ahead and jump in. Before we do, if you click that link above, watch that video, you can go ahead and comment on it and be entered for this Mafia hoodie, and you can look as good as this young man right here. And let's go ahead and roll right on over to the case. Now, my friends, as we jump into this, I have to remind you that I am just a doctor. I am not a lawyer, a legal, or anything, so we are just reading the court documents. And just note, this is only a determination about the motion that Eric Schurmeyer had put forth, wanting a basically freeze of assets of Mr. Thurston's assets so that, they could essentially get them back. And so this is not the whole case, okay? So do not get confused about that. And the Honorable Howard C. Nielsen here basically paints a wonderful, wonderful picture for us. There's so much great information in here, and he does such a good job of summarizing the case too. So let's just jump in here. First, he says, Mr. Schurmeyer requested a temporary restraining order, preliminary injunction, freezing surgeon assets that Mr. Thurston needed to provide an accounting for. The court denied that request and that motion. And the judge says, for simplicity, I'm going to call him Mr. Thurston. I'm not going to use this True North United, his little vehicle business company, okay? So he does do a wonderful breakdown here of the case. Mr. Schurmeyer, Mr. Thurston, two directors, large stakeholders of Gala Games Company, ministers of block gaming infrastructure. Among other things, Gala Games oversees distribution of their cryptocurrency called Gala, which players can trade to one another, use to make purchase with the company's games. This dispute arose after Mr. Thurston moved 8.6 billion Gala tokens, allegedly worth approximately $130 million, out of digital wallets to which both Mr. Schurmeyer and he had access, and into wallets to which only he had access. Mr. Schurmeyer maintains that the Gala tokens were company property and therefore calls this theft. Mr. Thurston contends that he owned the tokens and that was merely moving was what was rightfully his. Although Mr. Thurston moved the tokens in February 2021, Mr. Schurmeyer represents that he did not discover what had happened until that April. Schurmeyer then moved the remaining tokens into wallets to which Mr. Thurston did not have access to and began tracking the tokens Mr. Thurston had taken. More than a year later, in July 2022, Mr. Schurmeyer noticed that Mr. Thurston had begun moving the tokens out of his private wallets, an activity that allegedly continued for the next several months. Mr. Schurmeyer represents that he was concerned that Mr. Thurston was moving the tokens from private wallets where he could track them into the centralized exchanges where he could not, and that Mr. Thurston might precipitously be liquidating these tokens, causing the value of the remaining Gala tokens to plummet. So, at the end of 2022, Mr. Schurmeyer began developing a new cryptocurrency token, Gala V2. His plan was to replace all of the original Gala tokens, except those Mr. Thurston had taken, with Gala V2, which would render worthless any of the tokens Mr. Thurston had taken but not yet sold. Mr. Schurmeyer rolled out Gala V2 in May 2023, although Mr. Thurston may have liquidated as many as 3.5 billion Gala already. Before that rollout, going forward, he could no longer do anything with the remaining 5.1 billion now outdated tokens he had taken. The parties then engaged in some success and unsuccessful settlement negotiations until Mr. Schurmeyer filed this action at the end of August. That was a superb, nice little summary from the judge breaking down their big, long-winded case. Now, the judge goes into basically a whole bunch of different, cases. This is what judges do, cases to basically explain why something does not function or does not work. So we're just going to highlight a few of these things and then go into some more interesting parts. A party's harm is irreparable when the court would be unable to grant an effective monetary remedy after a full trial because such damages would be inadequate or difficult to ascertain. So one reason is saying that they could easily, get the money if they needed to. As a general proposition, delay in seeking preliminary relief cuts against finding irreparable injury. Now, what he's saying here is because Schurmeyer waited so long for this, quote, preliminary relief, that damages his case to actually, a possible irreparable injury. Basically saying it had been so long that, that the irreparable injury portion of this motion is not there. generally granted under the theory that there is an urgent need for speedy action to protect a plaintiff's rights. Obviously, it's been well over like a year and a half since this originally happened. And so he says, why do we need to freeze anything, right? Nothing has changed, during like all this time. And it's not something that needs to be happen really fast for any reason. Mr. Schirmeyer could have involved the judiciary at any point during this 2.5-year period, but chose not to do so. Once again, saying, hey, you waited forever. Why do we need to have all of a sudden this fast relief? So this is all fair, right, from the judge. Mr. Schirmeyer argues that his delay in filing suit was justified because he was hesitant to provoke Thurston in any way for concern that he might liquidate or dissipate the stolen Gala immediately, which he asserts could have caused the Gala Games ecosystem to collapse. But Mr. Schirmeyer's own reply brief cites a host of communications that belie any notion that he was hesitant to provoke Mr. Thurston. So this is pretty funny, which is true, right? So April 2021, he confronted Mr. Thurston, demanding that he move that Gala back into the wallets. 3 months later in July, Mr. Schirmeyer confronted Mr. Thurston again, sending him text messages. You have 8 billion Gala company reserves that you moved. Why? And December, still more than 9 months before this suit was filed, Mr. Schirmeyer sent Mr. Thurston another text message demanding that he stop selling the company Gala. So the judge is showing like, hey man, you showed that you weren't scared of provoking him. In short, the record does not support Mr. Schirmeyer's assertion that he waited 2.5 years to file suit because he was worried about provoking Mr. Thurston. The record does, however, suggest a different reason for the delay. It's so funny that judge is like, hey, this is your actual reason for delay, which I guess judges do sometimes, just explain what you should be saying. Mr. Schirmeyer did not bring this action promptly upon learning of Mr. Thurston's actions, and that was because he was engaged in self-help, right? And went into, quote, damage control mode. He moved the remaining Gala tokens into wallets he controlled, began tracking the 8.6 billion tokens that Mr. Thurston had taken. Finally, in May, Mr. Schirmeyer rolled out that new Gala token, the Gala V2, that in his own words, stopped the bleeding. Because Mr. Thurston could no longer use the remaining 5.1 billion tokens that he had not already liquidated. So does this painting a clear picture for everybody? This makes sense, right? Like the judge is like, hey, you already did all the damage control and you basically froze this guy's assets anyways. Well, froze the Gala assets that he had, right? And so, we don't need an emergency injunction here to like freeze assets. It thus appears that Mr. Schirmeyer delayed recourse to the courts until the emergency was contained and the risk of further harm largely averted. Yet the purpose of preliminary relief is not to remedy a past harm, but to protect plaintiffs from irreparable injury that will surely result without its issuance. So I'm hoping this makes sense for everybody because it completely makes sense to me why this motion is denied. Further, it is well settled that simple economic loss usually does not in and of itself constitute irreparable harm, and that's because such losses are compensable by money damages. So in this case, not only has the alleged wrong already occurred, the asserted injury resulting from that wrong is an economic loss. Further, the asserted loss is limited, specific, and readily ascertainable. So the judge is saying, hey, we have the very specific numbers. We can get this back if we need to from this person. The 3.5 billion tokens that have already been liquidated, assuming, of course, that he prevails on the merits of his claims, Mr. Schirmeyer could regain that 3.5 billion tokens, which what we said $130 million was the 8 billion. So this would be like, $60 billion worth at that, or $60 million worth. So he goes on to say, that cryptocurrency is fungible property. For instance, currencies, stock shares, open market presents no such difficulties to like value these. That cryptocurrency is the epitome of fungible property and provide an analog for traditional currency. So true, a plaintiff's economic loss may still be irreparable if he can show that the defendant will not have that money to pay for the loss after trial. However, we know that Thurston has like a $40 million Puerto Rican house. And I mean, the guy's millionaire, right? So I think our assumption is that he could pay for this. So for instance, preliminary injunction relief might be justified if the defendant were facing imminent insolvency, and the injunction would of course preserve any assets that the plaintiff could then recover after trial on the merits. So this was an excellent write-up from this judge. Now, yet just because it is easy for a defendant to dissipate assets does not make it likely that he will do so. Basically saying that cryptocurrency is easy to dissipate. More critically, even if the particular Gala tokens that Mr. Thurston took and allegedly liquidated are difficult to trace, that is of little consequence because once again, they have the initial numbers, right? So they don't need to trace it. They know that this is the exact amount that was, quote, stolen. This is, of course, if the merits are proven, and that it would be easy to basically put a number to that he would then be granted to get that money back. As discussed, cryptocurrency tokens are fungible, easy to value, show that he is likely to suffer irreparable injury. Mr. Schirmeyer must therefore demonstrate that Mr. Thurston would likely be unable to pay. So basically the judge is saying the only way to continue this motion or for any kind of motion like this to succeed is that he has to prove Mr. Thurston wouldn't be able to pay if he doesn't freeze his assets. Mr. Schirmeyer has not provided any evidence that Mr. Thurston lacks enough other resources to compensate Gala Games for its alleged loss. Whew. So, for the foregoing reasons, plaintiff's motion for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction is denied. It is so ordered. Signed by the Honorable Howard C. Nielsen. Now, if I'm not mistaken, from somebody who's very nice to me and talks with me about this stuff, I think Thurston has like 45 days now to respond before the rest of this case basically progresses forward. So essentially we are going to be waiting to see what happens. This is the latest update. Once again, this is just a motion being denied. And, I still think it's very clear that this was company funds, very clear that the company funds were the 8.6 billion Gala taken. So, Dr. Wookiee will keep you updated as we continue to progress down the legal thing, which of course is probably going to take some time. As always, stay warm, Wookiees.